Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. This podcast moves beyond questions of God's existence to ask, what's next in a godless world? If you're enjoying the show so far, remember to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon. Beyond Atheism is produced and distributed by Atheist United Studios.
We are joined today by Jamie Woodhouse. Jamie is a humanist, vegan, and most importantly for today, a sentientist. Jamie hosts the Sentientism Podcast and YouTube channel and has written articles and presented academic seminars on the Sentientism philosophy and its implications. Today we'll delve into exactly what it means to be a sentientist and how close atheists come already. Jamie, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Thank you. It's great to be here and honoured to have a chance to talk to your audience. And I've got to start by congratulations on your ability to pronounce sentientism, which is probably the biggest challenge we'll face in the conversation. So well done.
It was tricky and I was a little bit worried. But
you nailed it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Jamie, for coming on. I'm really looking forward to getting into sentientism with you. I guess before we get into sort of the more philosophical part, just a more lighter question. Do you remember when was the last time that you ate meat?
Oh, wow. Not specifically. I think I was in my maybe mid-20s. And I think I went through a phase where I was switching to vegetarianism for ethical reasons. But I was clinging on to my habits by suggesting that if the meat was going to waste anyway, there's surely no harm in me eating it. And as I discussed that with my friends, it became clear that they would then accidentally overorder. I realized I had to do it properly and then dropped it then. So that was probably 25 years ago, something like that.
Okay.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a while. So it's interesting. It started with moral feelings. Let's see. Okay. So veganism is growing. This is a weird one for us because veganism and atheism are highly, highly correlated, and we can't really figure it out. And it's kind of strange. And it's also becoming a lot easier to be vegan, or at least cut meat out. Have you used any of the replacement meats? Have you tried any of those?
Yeah, I have. So I've been vegetarian for maybe 25 something years, as I was saying. Been vegan for 5 or 6 now, and I've used quite a few of the replacements. My main foods are basically just different plants, really, but I'm quite interested in the alternatives. Partly because I still aesthetically quite enjoy them, but also I think they're going to be an important part of, as you said, making it easier for people to make this ethical switch. So I'm quite open-minded about them.
So so you've been vegan for 25 years. How long have you been a sentientist?
Well, not quite. I've been vegetarian for about 25 and vegan for about 5 or 6 now. So yeah.
Oh, okay. So but this is interesting because there's a progression here in like what you're changing, what you're cutting out. Was it guided by sentientism, or did veganism lead you to sentientism?
It was guided by it, but I didn't have a word for it at the time. So I had, if that makes sense. So I guess my journey through it really, I can start from the title of your podcast, because it was really a journey to atheism that started this whole thing off. So I grew up in a sort of fairly boring background, Anglican Christian context, and religion was never a particularly important part of our lives in rural England where we were. But in my teenage years, I did the sort of classic thing of just reading more widely, thinking a little bit more deeply about these things, learning about other religions, learning about other worldviews, learning about the history of religion too, and just came to the conclusion that they were much more likely to be human creations than something divinely inspired. So I essentially became an atheist somewhere in my teens. Atheism, by itself, in a way, it's somewhat uninteresting. It's just saying, I don't believe in this particular thing, right? Out of so many different things we could choose, but it doesn't say that much about ethics. So I then was looking for, okay, where do we go next in terms of ethics and morality? And that, as it does with many atheists, led me to humanism, because it kept the sort of naturalistic grounding of understanding the world, right? We'll use evidence and reason to think about reality, but it added on this compassion for all human beings. But I guess there was always a parallel thread in my mind, partly, reminded to me by my sister at the time, who went vegetarian much earlier than me, that humans aren't the only beings that matter. So there was this sort of animal ethics thing going on in the background in my head as well that led me through to vegetarianism and then veganism. And I guess what I've been trying to do with this sentientism idea is, in a way, take the best of both those two themes of thought and tie them together into something that makes sense for me.
Yeah. So why don't we turn to focusing on what exactly sentientism is? But I guess maybe one way to approach that is to ask first, what is sentience?
Yeah. I'd summarize sentience as the capacity to have experiences. So, an easy way into that is to think something or someone is sentient if they can suffer, feel bad things, or if they can flourish, feel good things. So any of those experiences, that's sentience. And as ever in sort of philosophical and scientific debates, there's some fuzziness around the edges and, some degree of confusion and overlapping definitions. But I think that's the core. Is, if something can have experiences, then that is sentience.
Can you give us some examples? Because this is a famous problem in veganism too, where you draw the line. Some people, the controversy in veganism is things like honey. Is there a hard and fast line in sentientism? Is it something that's being worked out? Like, what is sentient and what isn't? Are there very, very clear examples?
This is partly where it's useful to bring in the definition of sentientism as a whole, because in a way it's irritatingly neutral on lots of really important questions, because it focuses on answering the two, what I think of as the two deepest questions: what's real and who matters. So on the what's real question, it's very much a naturalistic commitment. We should use evidence and reason to ground our credences rather than revelation or supernatural beliefs or something else. So in that sense, that naturalistic way of thinking about reality is, a great deal in common with humanism and free thinkers and skeptics and the way many atheists think. And then the answer to the who matters question is this one about, well, all sentient beings should matter. But irritatingly, sentientism doesn't tell us which entities are sentient. It doesn't sort of have a list of species or a list of things that can or can't be sentient. It just says wherever we find sentience and whichever beings are sentient, they all matter, because ultimately all suffering matters, all flourishing matters. Why should we exclude any of those things from our moral thinking? And then it suggests we should use a naturalistic approach, a scientific approach maybe, to try and work that out. So even scientists will disagree about whether sentience is a binary thing that's switched on and switched off, whether it's got fuzzy boundaries, exactly which species may or may not be sentient, whether there are degrees of sentience. So it's sort of irritatingly neutral on that. But I think most sentientists, because of that naturalistic commitment, would start at least with scientific consensus. And at the moment, scientific consensus, or my view of it, is that, the three of us are sentient, as are all other humans. I'm not 100% confident of that, but I'll give you guys the benefit of the doubt.
Yes.
But we can extend that using different lines of inference to many, many animals. So mammals, reptiles, birds, and actually increasing evidence that many of the invertebrates are sentient to some degree as well. So I have quite an expansive view of where sentience takes us within the animal kingdom. There's disagreement about the edges. But I also think that because we're thinking about ethics and morality, it makes sense to be quite prudent as well. And, where there's uncertainty, maybe we should be giving certain entities the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. And well, on a sort of practical level, like, what does sentientist ethics consist of? I mean, we've already talked a little bit. I mean, like, veganism, I guess, is sort of a big part of it. But what other sort of practical, ethical decisions or whatever come out of sentientism?
So there's lots of disagreement, partly because sentientism, all it does is focuses on what I'd call moral scope, who matters.
Okay, right.
And there it just tells you every sentient being matters. And in a sense, that's it, right? There's no more specific prescription or set of implications. It's just a definition of moral scope. So, but then you can think about lots of different ethical systems you might apply to that. So you might take a consequentialist or a utilitarian approach that thinks about the quality of sentient experiences as being utility, and you might use that to guide your thinking. You might take a virtue ethics approach that thinks about kindness, but that kindness by definition should extend to all sentient beings, of course, because they all matter. You might take a deontological approach where instead of thinking about humans as being ends in themselves and following certain rules that respect that, you could think about all sentient beings be ends in themselves. So there's an enormous pluralism in moral thinking you might then apply once you've accepted all sentient beings should matter. But that doesn't mean anything goes, because I think I would draw a pretty clear baseline that if we're saying, look, we have moral consideration for every sentient being, at the very least, that should insist that we don't needlessly cause suffering or death to a sentient being. You might argue about how demanding our moral theory should be beyond that. Should we have higher levels of obligation? Is there more we should do? How far should we go? But I'd suggest that at the very least, if compassion or moral consideration is going to mean anything, it should mean we wouldn't needlessly harm or kill. And yes, in practical terms, that leads to veganism, I think, because in a sense, the philosophical definition of veganism is doing what we can as far as reasonable and practical to avoid causing suffering, death, and exploitation for sentient animals. So it's very pluralistic, but at the same time, I do think there's some pretty clear radical implications of any interpretation of sentientism.
So it sounds like just a widening of the circle of what matters in the world. Is that fair to say?
It's that. It's that plus the naturalistic commitment.
Mm-hmm.
And some would even challenge this idea of a widening circle. The idea of this sort of expanding circle, I think, is a powerful one, because intuitively, we think that we evolved to think about kin and family and maybe groups, and then as humanity has developed in various cultures from thousands of years, we have in a sense expanded that circle of concern. But some people are also nervous about talking about it as a circle, because it implies that we're always in the middle,
right? Yes, yes.
And it also implies that we're in charge of the extension too. Yes. So I quite like the idea of thinking about moral scope. Who matters, and it is an extension of where most humans are. Although interestingly, in a way, I think default human culture is not far off in theory already, because I think when you talk to most people who have a broad concern about humanity, you talk to humanists, for example, and say, which humans should we care about? They will tell you, well, all of them, of course, right? There might be to different degrees, we might prioritize in different ways, but at least every human matters. We shouldn't needlessly cause them suffering or death. And I think most humans, hopefully, at least many of them, would agree with that to some degree. But then you ask, okay, well, why do you care about other humans? And at the root of that normally is the fact that those humans can suffer and can flourish. We care about what it's like to be them. We care about their perspective. We care about their experiences. So in a way, the reason most of us have compassion for other humans is because we care about their sentience. It's not just because they happen to be the same species as us. So in that sense, many people who have a human concern, that concern is driven by sentience. And of course, many humans already care about non-human sentience too, because we all know that humans aren't the only beings that can suffer, and nearly every human, at least to some degree, cares about non-humans too, whether it's selected animals in the wild or companion animals as well. So there's this sort of theoretical latent agreement of humanity with that sentiocentric moral scope already. It's just that as with religion, our current social norms train us out of that stance and turn us away from the implications.
Yeah, but I think humanism does have a different, maybe at the core, what the message is. Well, because I think if you push on humanists about sentientism, right, and like why we should care for other things, or about like deep ecology, or like why humanists would be concerned about the environment, at the core, it would be philosophically what it comes back to is the value of human life, right? We need to respect the environment, not just as the environment, not necessarily as the environment, but because of it's conducive to human life. It's conducive to human thriving. If we destroy it, we'll harm humanity. So there does seem to be an extra step there, which itself is a step from atheism. I mean, atheism was a good place for you to start. How did you make that move? What else do we need to add to atheism and then to humanism to get to sentientism? And is there anything we need to strip away from atheism that you find, well, atheism holds this valuable and it's something that we need to relieve ourselves of to think more and act more like a sentientist?
Yeah, I think there's There's probably two primary challenges, and the first one is one we've already explored, which is while most atheists and most humanists, I think, would already, in theory, have some moral consideration for non-human sentient beings because of their sentience. In practice, our social norms block us from putting it into practice. So there's an obvious challenge there of formally extending our moral scope to include all sentient beings and then putting into practice at least a minimal level of compassion and moral consideration for them. So that's one central challenge, I think, to atheism and to humanism, is to extend that compassion more broadly, because all suffering should matter. So that's obvious, and we've talked about that already. And theoretically, that's easy. Given our dominant social norms, that's extremely hard to do. But I think it is an imperative. But I think there is another challenge to atheism, because in a way, I did come to atheism first, but now I think of it the other way around. My atheism is because of my commitment to a methodological naturalism, which I guess is just a broader way of understanding reality. So if I'm thinking about what's real and how should I go about choosing what to believe or what to have credences in, that is naturalism. So there's loads of different flavors of naturalism. One is just the statement that
could
the
you tell
natural
us a
world
bit
is
more
all.
about your flavor of naturalism? Because I'm not sure what exactly how exactly that's being used here.
Well, I think there's a couple of flavors, and my personal view is, I sign up to both of them. So one is if you like, an ontological naturalism, which is, and I'm not a philosopher here, so the pros will correct me, including you guys, but it's the statement that the natural world exhausts reality. There's no supernatural, there's no deities, there's no angels, there's no magical, mystical stuff beyond the natural world. The natural world is all there is, and that's all that exists. The second type of naturalism, which is the one that's actually in the definition of sentientism, is more about the method you go about using to try and form beliefs and so on. And that's the evidence and reason idea. So the idea there is, regardless of whether you think the entire universe is just natural, what we should do when we're thinking about forming beliefs and credences is use evidence and reason as we go about doing that. So we shouldn't use revelation or supernatural sources of knowledge. We shouldn't just believe people arbitrarily. We should use evidence and reason as well as we can. We're never going to be perfect. That should be the method we use, the grounding for our beliefs. So in a way, that methodological naturalism is, before I knew the term, was what led me to atheism. But I think there's a challenge there too to atheists, because the question of religion is obviously a really culturally central one for naturalism, because it's such a massive cultural story and a sense of identity and history there. So when you think about naturalism, you're obviously drawn to thinking about theism and atheism and so on as the biggest topic maybe, but it's certainly not the only one. And I think there are many atheists who have sort of, I think rightly concluded that atheism is the correct answer. But they sometimes fail to apply their naturalism as well in other domains. And I think that can be a real problem. You can sort of jump to, right, I'm super confident in atheism, but I'm still going to allow myself to believe all sorts of other crazy shit that's totally unfounded.
Right. Yeah.
So in that sense, there's a challenge there to atheists who's like, well done for being correct on one question. Yeah. Firstly, let's apply your naturalism in a much broader context to every other domain too. And we'll still find places to disagree, but at least if we're all committed to using evidence and reason in a high integrity way, hopefully we can have a constructive conversation. So those would be my two challenges, and they overlap as well, because one of the frustrations, I think, I think you're right. When I talk to atheists and humanists, there's a really strong synergy between sentientism and those worldviews, because we all share this naturalistic commitment, and actually, I also think we share this idea that because we don't need a supernatural basis for our morality, we can use a naturalistic understanding of the world to drive our moral thinking, right? We don't need a God to tell us that suffering is bad, right? We can work on that. In a sense, that's what humanism has done, and sentientism is just taking it to the next level. So there's a strong synergy. But at the same time, there's also enormous cultural pushback, even from within the atheist and the skeptic and the humanist communities, to thinking about animal ethics. It's almost like the topic for some people is like kryptonite. They have this intellectual bravery and courage to break free from harmful social norms, using evidence and reason to find a more compassionate way of thinking, except when it comes to thinking about non-human animal ethics. And in that situation, they seem often just as trapped with these harmful social norms. But that links to the epistemology, because I guess part of the reason why I think worldviews are important is because almost every human caused problem to me seems to come back to either a failure of compassion, we just don't care, or we exclude some suffering beings from our consideration. So that's obvious, a failure of compassion. But there's also a failure of epistemology. We just get stuff wrong. And part of the reason I think this topic is a bit like kryptonite for many atheists and humanists, and they really struggle to engage with it with integrity, is with some it's a failure of compassion. They just carve out, for example, farmed animals or some wild animals and say, look, they don't matter. But more often it's actually some epistemological breakdowns as well that are enforced by social norms and marketing. So people will believe, for example, things like, animal farming can be humane. And I would argue that's an epistemological failure, that you would not come to that conclusion if you, in a fair-minded way, used evidence and reason to form your beliefs. So I'm rambling on a little bit, but I think that's why there's a synergy, but there's also really strong pushback. And I think it's a good illustration of why compassion isn't enough. Naturalism isn't enough. You need both. You need a combination of a really well-grounded naturalism so you understand reality well, and then you need this compassionate scope that makes sure no suffering being is excluded. And then I think we're on a more solid footing. So those are the challenges I'd put to atheism writ large.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Jamie on this question about the links between atheism and sentientism. Well, I wanted to ask, like, who would you have more in common with? Would sort of Christian who's a vegan, or an atheist who's a meat eater?
Yeah, it's tough. It depends on how they apply their wider Christian worldview as well, because there's so many different sorts of Christians.
Yeah,
if they were the sort of Christian that was focused on universal compassion and love, and had redefined out of existence the concept of hell, and had stripped out the sexism and the anti-Semitism and the homophobia and all the other stuff that comes with some varieties of Christianity. So they were a sort of modern, universally ethical Christian who was also vegan. I'd probably pick them.
Okay.
So basically not a Christian is what I'm hearing. That would be a very strange church.
Well, I think there are many Christians who are already on that path and have sort of got to that point already. So so I'm dodging the answer. But it is difficult because because there's also a counter argument, which is, if you've got someone who doesn't have this sentiocentric compassion but is genuinely committed to naturalistically understanding the world, I don't think they can avoid extending compassion to all sentient beings, because there's no, as far as I've explored, any evidence base or rationale or philosophical logic that would justify excluding non-human sentient beings from moral consideration. So in a sense, I think, a naturalistic commitment sort of leads you inexorably towards caring about all sentient beings, if you really want to be consistent, coherent, and so on. But at the same time, that universal compassion is deeply important too.
Yeah. But this isn't just, you're not talking about something that's merely a performative way of acting, right? It's not just someone who is a vegan because they have to be a vegan, right? They joined a cult. The cult is vegan. Therefore they're vegan.
Right.
It's not just going through these motions and saying like all animals are precious. It's someone who believes it because of this philosophical reason, right? They come to it as part of an understanding of the natural world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a worldview, so it's a philosophy and a way of thinking. So that's the core of it. But at the same time, the practical implications are important too. So in the same way as if someone said to you, "Look, I'm a humanist, but I do these terrible things to other humans," you'd question their philosophical commitment. In the same way as a sentientist, there are clear practical implications that we need to carry through as well. But you're right; it's more about the philosophical stance. That's the core of it, and then that has practical implications. But it's not practical implications that then it doesn't work quite the other way around, if that makes sense. And you can see that in veganism. Of course, there are many people who essentially boycott non-human animal products, which is the core of veganism, and they might do it for environmental reasons or health reasons or other reasons. That's not quite the same. Veganism itself is actually a philosophical stance. So arguably, that's why you hear terms like people talking about plant-based or alternative terms, because in a way, veganism itself is a philosophical stance, a bit like in the same way as sentientism is.
Yeah. I wanted to ask how sentientism kind of extends more broadly to politics or whatever. I mean, I'm an aspiring vegan, I guess. I mean, there's still some things I eat that have milk ingredients in them or whatever, just because it's so difficult to avoid. But I think, about sort of broader ethical questions. For example, I mean, like I look around my apartment and think about all the stuff, that was made. It's probably was made in working conditions that wouldn't be very good for other humans. I mean, I imagine. I mean, I mean, I imagine that's the case. And I mean, I just wonder, how does sentientism think about these bigger sort of ethical questions? I mean, which extend to things like the welfare of other humans and so on. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, other humans are sentient beings too. Right?
Yeah.
So in a way, a sentientist stance would absolutely inherit, vast tranches of existing ethics that focus on how we care about other humans. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't magically resolve those things.
Right,
So just as we might think about, exploitation in the supply chain of a product we buy, we might think about government policies or, what goes on at the UN, and we might struggle with priorities and funding and, and really difficult ethical trade-offs just in the human sphere. Sentientism doesn't fix those problems. Arguably, it adds an additional one, which says you've got to extend your moral scope out even further. So I think with the sentientist way of thinking, in a way, we have all of those challenges about priorities and trade-offs and difficult thought experiments and the reality of politics. And, so sentientism doesn't necessarily resolve those things for us, because all it's saying is the moral scope needs to be broader so that we don't exclude any sentient being. Having said that, one of the things that's useful is that I think we found this within the development of human rights thinking, for example, that I think most people would agree that as we've thought more generously about human rights, we've gone somewhat haltingly from, in-group, out-group distinctions and nationalism to, at least in theory, most countries around the world signing up to a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we know how far away we are from implementing that. But at least conceptually, to have as a species signed up to that is a pretty bold step. And I'd argue it's benefited to some degree the people who needed those rights according and needed to be taken more seriously, although there's so much more to do. But it's also benefited the people who were lucky enough to have the power and the position to do that thinking in the first place and to be more generous. And I think the same can be true as we extend our moral consideration beyond the human species, that it's not just a altruistic stance of generosity to non-human species. It's actually good for us human beings who are sentient too. And you can see that in so many different implications. So I guess one of the dark hearts, if you think about a sentientist stance, and you say, well, I'm just going to start thinking again about my ethics and morality and the state of the world, thinking about all the sentient beings on the planet. One of the obvious things that jumps out at you clearly, and we've hinted at it already, is the farming of animals. There's about 7.9 billion humans, and we farm, if you include fish, probably between 1.5 and 2 trillion sentient animals every year for largely trivial ends. So that jumps out at you immediately as a sort of stark horror. There's a tiny number of sentient beings with enormous power who are exploiting, harming, killing many trillions of others. So that jumps out at you as a stark ethical problem. But by resolving that, which is something I do think we'll manage to do over the next years and decades, you also help us humans too, because when you look at the environmental knock-on concerns about land use, water use, emissions, zoonotic disease, human health implications, it ends up being a win-win for us and for the environment, as well as for the sentient beings that we're extending more compassion to. So often it can feel really emotionally and intellectually difficult to extend our moral scope of concern, but quite often when you do the analysis, it ends up actually benefiting us too.
Which I think that sounds like it's part of the heart of it. It should benefit everything that's sentient, right? That would be key.
and that's an important point that I would make to many in the animal advocacy and the vegan movements too, because there's a theme that comes through those movements, which we could understand, right? Because it's a little bit like having the blinkers taken off. Once you've seen just how the average human interacts with the average non-human on the planetary scale I was just discussing, it's such a stark and awful thing that can lead you to have a very negative view about humanity as a whole, right? And you look at our track record. So that's an important thing to remind ourselves of is, us human beings are sentient beings that matter too. And we all warrant compassion, even the humans that are doing harm and even the humans that we disagree with. So to the earlier point, in a way, sentientism isn't just about saying now we need to care about non-human animals. It actually also needs to inherit all of the modern, human ethics as well, about fighting discrimination and exploitation and being universally against all forms of oppression, because us humans are sentient beings that are subject to that stuff too, and we matter as victims and perpetrators.
Right. And that's a great point, because it also sets up a distinction between like something that sentientism is not, right? It's not the same as sort of the deep ecology that says it's the environment above all else, right? It privileges the natural world at the expense of the human world, the human-made world.
It's distinct from that. And you talked to a previous guest, Monica Miller, who I think qualifies as a sentientist. I've had some great chats with her. And her work was amazing because it covers both sides of this, right? She's working on the secularism side and she's working on the non-human animal ethics side as well. But you talk to her about, what is this sliding scale, if you like, of moral concern? And the way I tend to think of it is, on the one hand, you have anthropocentrism, which is sort of focusing on humans. And then you go to a sentiocentrism, which cares about all sentient beings. But as you say, there are further levels. There's a biocentrism that cares about all living things. So you might include plants there, even though they're not sentient, it would be a direct consideration for them. And then even beyond that, an ecocentrism that cares about even the non-living stuff, rocks, rivers, trees, ecosystems, the earth has Gaia too. Sentientism does draw a distinction there, because ultimately it's saying at least we need to include all sentient beings in our moral consideration. So it's open-minded if you want to go further, but really sentience is what counts. It's that quality of experience that counts. And there's a frustration in that many in the deep ecology movement, or even in the mainstream environmental movement, have gone from sort of anthropocentric focus on humans to a rich, deep concern for the environment itself. But unfortunately, most of those people seem to skip the sentient beings in the middle.
Right.
So you find environmentalists who will sidestep the problems of animal agriculture, and you'll find environmentalists who sometimes, to protect non-sentient parts of the environment, will be quite happy to cull many hundreds or thousands or millions of sentient beings in the wild too. So sentientism draws us back to focusing on the quality of experience, suffering, flourishing, life and death as being really the raw material of morality. And the biosphere and the ecosphere are deeply and powerfully important, but they're important because of their impact on the sentient beings. They're not important in their own right, and they're certainly not important to the extent that you would, harm or kill sentient beings to, protect something that has no experience whatsoever and won't care either way.
All right. So we have this moral circle, but that's maybe not a circle, but just for illustration. And that encompasses all of this sentient life. But I think the thing you're stressing here is that it doesn't privilege one form over the other, right? We're keeping all of them in mind equally.
Well, this is another space. This is another space where sentientism is a little bit irritating, because it doesn't insist that every sentient being gets the same moral consideration. It just says they all need to be given moral consideration and we should have compassion for them all, but it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly equal. So there are some sentientists who will push more for an egalitarian approach, and there are others who will talk about whether sentience is a really rich, multidimensional thing that could have different degrees of intensity, for example, and that might warrant us granting different levels of moral consideration to different sentients. And of course, then you've got just the practical choices about prioritization that we all have to take in our own lives. So rather than saying every sentient being is equivalent, a mosquito and a human child are exactly of equal worth. You'd struggle to find someone who would really carry that through into practice in daily life. It's more about setting this baseline that's saying we should at least have serious moral consideration for every sentient being, and that means we wouldn't needlessly harm or kill.
Have you ever had any of those considerations, like a real struggle between which side of the fence you would fall on? Are there any times when taking these moral considerations, it could be something big, like, we have a housing crisis, we need to build more homes for people. but we're going to have to tear down an old growth forest. That's a big one where these things come into conflict. I'm thinking something like that, or maybe something personal where it's just like, how do I either morally justify this, or just a quandary that you came to as a sentientist, and how did you resolve it?
Well, there are so many, and there's a danger here as well that this becomes about purity or perfection, and we just it's impossible to live without causing some sort of harm or even death to some sentient being. We just can't do it. So in a way, we shouldn't be holding ourselves necessarily to that standard. I think it could potentially even backfire. But I guess the stance is saying, we don't know how to resolve all of these trade-offs. Ethics is really, really difficult, and many decisions are extremely hard, and we have moral uncertainty, we have epistemological uncertainty about the fact of the matter on so many things. The stance is simply saying we just have a better chance of taking a more ethical decision if we don't exclude any of the sentient beings from moral consideration. So in that context you were talking about, you could talk about, okay, these humans need new housing, so a forest is going to be cut down. One approach is to only think about the human interests. The other approach is to think about the wild sentient beings that will be impacted, the habitats that will be shifted around, and what impact that might have. And you may come to the same conclusion, but at least you have a better chance if you make sure none of the sentient beings are excluded from your moral consideration.
So in your process, you value sentient life and what they would experience.
Yeah.
Whenever we think about, even if it's something like, I don't know, where we put the bird feeder, right? It's not just about the view for me, it's how are the birds going to be able to get to it? Something like that.
Yeah. And which in a way is just an extension of our intuitive intrahuman ethics. I think there are some slightly more outlandish ethical systems that, whether they're supernaturally driven, so it's divine command theory. So, basically good and bad is driven by obedience or modeling a deity. That's one ethical approach. There's a nihilistic one where you say, essentially you're turning away from ethics and morality completely. There's a relativistic one which says, almost arbitrarily, if a group agrees something's good or bad, then that's the answer, right? But if we put those ethical systems to one side, it seems to me the essence of ethics and morality is about considering the perspective of the other, and valuing that in the same way they would. So the reason I might care about you and I wouldn't want to harm you and I might want to help you is because I'm thinking about what it's like to be Todd or Nathan, and I'm valuing that because of your own perspective. So in a way, sentientism is saying, it might be harder to do that across the species boundary, but to the extent it's possible and prudently, we should take the perspective of other beings into consideration too. So just as there's a puppy at my feet here, intuitively, I think everybody would look into their eyes, and you can do all the science about evolutionary adaptivity and information processing architecture and inferences of sentience from behavior and communications and so on, or you just look into the eyes of a puppy and go, well, I know they're sentient. And the reason we care about the puppy, the companion animal that shares our home, is not just because they're fun or because they're cute to look at. It's because we do actually care about how they feel. Right, and that's the essence of what we're talking about here, is just extending that compassion and that taking the perspective of the other out to include all sentient beings.
Yeah. Why do you think? Well, you mentioned that it seems to sentientism kind of should flow from naturalism or atheism, but why do you think some people don't get there? I mean, why doesn't everyone make that leap, basically?
Yeah, social norms. Mm-hmm. I think that's the core of it. So one interesting thought experiment is if you just think about, I guess where we start out as very young humans. This is oversimplifying, but let me play it out. So, there's an 18-month or a 2-year-old toddler crawling around. On the epistemology side, I think it's fair enough to say that in a way they're little naturalists. They don't necessarily yet have any unfounded beliefs. They are exploring their environment. They're using their senses. They're trying to understand reality in a sort of honest way with many limitations. They're like mini scientists trying to work out what's going on. And as they grow older, they're taught by society and family and friends. They're taught a bunch of things that just aren't true. But they're also taught some epistemological methods that are terrible too. So they're taught about faith, or just because, or because a figure in authority tells you this, or there's a revelation. So their epistemology and their ontology, if you like, are taken away from that naturalistic starting point. And I think atheists and humanists would say, well, let's get back to that sort of sense of, an attempt to be unbiased and neutral in our thinking, to engage honestly with reality, to try and understand it. And I think there's something similar going on the ethics side as well, because there are instances, of course, of normally young boys experimenting with and harming animals. But I think by and large, most young children don't just feel an intuitive compassion and empathy for other humans. When even young babies see their mother crying, they will express, they'll respond in kind and show compassion. But they do that across the species boundary as well. So if I think you put a toddler with a potbelly pig or some other farmed animal, and said, well, that will taste nice if you kill it, there's no way they're going to do that, right? It's just right. They have an intuitive sense of concern for the suffering of others that I think is quite deep. But then again, as we grow up, family, friends, society, and multi-billion-dollar industrial marketing budgets, one, distance us from particularly the practice of food and clothing and some of the other products we use, so that the implications and the consequences of our choices are intelligently hidden and taken away from us. But we're also told that it's not just acceptable, but actually desirable, and in some cases even imperative to our identity, to pay someone else to needlessly harm and kill other sentient beings for what for most of us are largely trivial reasons. So in both cases, I'd say the real problem isn't one of epistemology, facts and evidence and reason. And it's not even one of human compassion, because I think we all have it. It's really one of really powerful social norms that we've got to break. And there I do see there's a strong parallel between the social norms that hold together maybe a religious or a supernatural or a magical or a mystical worldview, and the power of a set of social norms that privilege humans and justify what we do to non-humans. Both of those seem to be two very big, powerful social norm edifices that we need to chip away at and break down. And I think they are breaking. Sorry, that was a really long ramble, right? But to come back to your question, that's part of my frustration, because atheists, humanists, secularists, free thinkers, skeptics, they've already followed the path, right? They've recognized some powerful, harmful social norms. They've used the tools of evidence and reason to chip away and break those norms. They've shown the intellectual and the social courage and bravery, at often quite serious personal risk, to move away and say, I no longer believe, I'm going to take this down a different route. And they found often a more compassionate ethic at the end of it. And I guess I'm saying, you're not done, right? You basically need to do the same thing in the field of non-human animal ethics, and indeed non-human sentient ethics, and again break from these very obviously harmful social norms, follow evidence and reason, and you'll end up at a more compassionate place. That's where there's this weird mix of a really powerful synergy that you talked about before, where there does seem to be a really powerful link between these sort of two movements and ways of thinking that in a way sentientism is trying to formalize and establish. But that's my frustration at when humanists and atheists treat this topic like kryptonite. It's like, you're not supposed to be trapped by dogma. You're supposed to be brave enough to challenge traditions and social norms. You're supposed to think clearly about ethics and to drive, through evidence and reason, rather than being trapped by what your mum and dad told you and what your society tells you.
Yeah. Have you seen any change in that recently? How long have you been working on this, and what changes have you seen?
I have seen changes. I mean, it's been, I guess, to varying degrees, different bits of the work have been over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's partly been, building out a website, and there's a YouTube and a podcast. But I've also been doing some article writing and public speaking, and quite a bit of that has been with humanist and atheist groups, actually. And I do see things shifting. There is a lot of pushback, but there's also openness and an engagement and a recognition that, in a way, this is almost like the next logical evolution for someone who's followed a humanist path. So I've had fascinating conversations with people like Peter Tatchell, for example. He's one of the patrons of Humanists UK, and he's a world famous LGBTQ rights activist. The man's a hero. But that was one of the things he said is, I count myself a humanist, but this is the next level. This is where we need to go. And I think you can see that even within the formality of some humanist organizations around the world. So Humanist UK and International have both updated their definitions of humanism to say, include at least concern for other sentient beings too. I'd like them to go much further, but you can see that I think people are engaging their thinking. Amy Halpern-Laff and I spoke at the last AHA conference, for example, and again, it was a really positive, engaging session, and we're following up with that group again to think about taking it to the next level. So I'm encouraged. The pushback is frustrating, but that's always the way when you're trying to change powerful social norms.
Yeah. Have you gotten much pushback? What form does the pushback take?
The pushback is actually quite virulent and quite strong. So it can be, and it's difficult to know, what percentage of humanists or atheists feel this way. But for the ones that do, they're pretty vocal and pretty strong. And I think that is because it feels like a real challenge to something they think is a core part of their identity. And there's also something deeply understandable about human psychology, and I've thought this way for a long while too, where it's a basic assumption that what I am doing and what my society are doing must be good because we're good people, right? So my society that I'm part of, and I'm a good person. I know I'm a good person because I feel a good person. So the things we do must be good. And it's really difficult when someone, however directly or subtly or carefully or brutally, points out that's not the case, right? The instinctive response, as with any social norm being challenged, is to push back. So for some people, they will say, no, humanism is about humans. The clue's in the name. That's it. Others will warp their epistemology and they will say, oh, well, non-human animals can't experience suffering despite all the science that shows us that's not the case. Or they will play along with the story that the animal agriculture industries tell us and that many people want to believe, which is, it's all about happy cows and happy chickens and farmers caring for their animals and, farming can be humane. But again, when you look at what the word humane means, and as soon as you understand even the most basic definitions of the standard practices that go on in even the most free range, supposedly ethical farms, it's just factually untrue. So it's really interesting to see, humanist atheist skeptics follow those classic sort of paths. And again, it's reminiscent of the response you might get if you challenge someone's Christianity or Islamic beliefs, for example.
Yeah.
It's the same package of human responses often.
Yeah, I think it's because maybe the person being, well, not even necessarily criticized, but the subject of the criticism, I guess, is like maybe they realize that there's something to that, to the point, and they can't sort of reconcile like the cognitive dissonance or something, and then the way they reconcile it is to kind of push back against the person. Yeah. And I think yeah.
And this is one important thing to remember, and I try and do this by remembering my prior self, right? So when I was a vegetarian, of course, I get people challenging my vegetarianism and calling me weird and all the usual arguments. But I would also have people say, well, then why aren't you vegan?
Yes,
look at what happens look at what happens in egg production or dairy production, and you only have to ask the question, what happens to the male children? And all of a sudden a whole new world opens up to you, right? So and my response to them was the same as most people responding to me talking about veganism and sentientism, which was avoid the topic because it's uncomfortable and I don't like where the implication is going to go, and I don't want to make the change because it feels socially weird. Cognitive dissonance, as you said, even acrasia, which as I understand it is like the next level where you've resolved the cognitive dissonance but you still can't bring your actions in line.
Right. Yes.
Or you warp your epistemology or you warp your ethics to fit the way you are at the moment. And I was a master at all of those different things. So I try and use that to remember to be compassionate when I'm talking to people.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of the flip side of it too, which I find really strange and irrational, is when you say you're vegan to someone or you don't eat meat or you're vegetarian or whatever, and how defensive they get about it.
Right.
That's very shocking.
Yeah.
And what it always suggests is that they know there's something wrong with their behavior. Mm-hmm. They see when a meat eater talks with a vegan, they lash out. In part, it seems because they know that they're in the wrong.
Yeah. And it's difficult as well because I think it has parallels with lots of other social justice causes, right? Once you've seen the problem, it's so easy to get righteous and strident and preachy and, get on a high horse and moral superiority, right? And the response to that is often one that's defensive, and the dialogue breaks down. And it's understandable why people get preachy, because it's important to preach about all of these social justice issues, non-human animal ethics included. But sometimes it isn't the most productive way through a conversation. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the shock really turns people around and their eyes are opened and they change. So there is another approach, which is trying to build on that common ground and talk about, how do we feel about other humans and non-human companion animals, and wanting consistent ethics and building up to it and explaining how easy it is and the other benefits of it as well. But there's also dangers there, because that softer approach, can risk losing the ethical sharpness. And we're talking about something, I think pretty deeply egregious here too. So it's like many other social justice issues. It's quite hard to get the balance right of effectiveness and ethical clarity on topics that are rightly extremely emotional for both sides.
Well, let's make it a lot clearer through the lightning round, and we'll figure out. We're going to ask you some short yes or no questions. A good answer is yes or no. There are no wrong answers. There are probably no right answers either.
And can I get my disclaimer in early?
Yes, please.
Go ahead. Yes.
Right. So I'm going to try and go for yes or no answers, just because it would be really irritating for me to.
You should give an explanation.
Yeah, you can give a brief explanation.
Yeah. Okay. But I guess the starting point is I'm only one sentientist.
Yes.
There are many, many others.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get to define what's right or wrong. It's just it's just a worldview that people may or may not like, and it's also really pluralistic and really basic as well. So you can take it in lots of different ways. Yes. So okay. I will just share my own personal stance.
Okay.
Explain if it's interesting.
Yeah. Perfectly acceptable.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I guess the lightning round is, can a true usually we do, can a true atheist do such and such, but Jamie, for you we're going to do, can a true sentientist. And so the first question, can a true sentientist believe in God?
No. Again, some may disagree, but I think it's similar to if you asked a humanist that question. I think if we have a naturalistic commitment, you could argue, okay, I'm committed to methodological naturalism. I use evidence and reason. That evidence has led me to conclude that there is a God. So, there is a path there. But I'd still default to a reasonable no, because I think from my experience, people who do have a deep belief in God have either got there through faith or revelation or some other approach that isn't methodological naturalism, or quite often they've started with a belief in God and then they've used selectively evidence and reason to try and justify that, rather than doing what I think of as a proper naturalism, which is you start with the evidence and reason and then come to the belief, rather than starting with the belief and then trying to justify it. So that's probably a little cheeky, but yeah, I if I'm pushed for a yes or no, I'd probably say no.
That's great. Okay. Can a true sentientist eat eggs?
No.
Wow.
And again, with all of these things, there are exceptions you might find and thought experiments and so on. But again, the default answer is no. And the reason for that is that the production of eggs causes catastrophic harm and death to other sentient beings. And for nearly everybody on the planet, our use of eggs is one of, it's not a sufficient justification for the implications of that. Largely it's for fairly trivial reasons. So yeah, no is the short answer.
Okay. I have follow-ups, but we should persist. Can a true sentientist eat honey?
No.
Wow.
Okay.
So you're going for it. You're committed.
I'm trying to start with a clear answer, and then I can wiggle around it as well.
Yeah.
So again, sentientists will disagree about insect and invertebrate sentience and where it sits. But my understanding of the modern scientific consensus is that bees, interestingly, there's quite a lot of evidence that they seem to be sentient. So I think a default sentientist would say, yes, bees are sentient. So, they're moral subjects that matter. And then the question is, okay, what does the production of honey do to them? Does it cause suffering and death? And in short, the answer is yes, it does. And there's an interesting angle there as well, and that there are some sentientists, and again, it depends on your ethical system, that even regardless of causing suffering and death would still be against exploitation as as a practice in its own right, even if there isn't suffering or death caused. So those people would say, and there's suffering, death, and there's explicit exploitation going on too. So they'd turn away from that. And I guess in practical terms, this is another really important thing to think about. Whenever you're thinking about, should we do X? It's always important to think about, are there better alternatives? And there nearly always are. So honey is another one where the alternatives are really easy and direct and cheap. And that's a bit of color around the note.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Can a true sentientist believe in an afterlife?
I'd say no. Again, similar reason to the God answer. I think there are some people who might say they've followed a naturalistic approach of evidence and reasoning, in an unbiased way. They've considered the evidence, they've thought more broadly, and they've come to the conclusion there is an afterlife. I struggle to see how you can get there if your naturalism has been of a sufficiently high quality. I think it's possible, but unlikely. And this is one of the dangers about, I think we might share this amongst atheists and humanists and sentientist communities, because we're committed to a naturalistic way of understanding the world. There is a trap here for us that you can assess other people's quality of naturalism based on whether they agree with me or not.
Right.
and that's not really what naturalism is about, right? It's not that. So but still no.
Okay.
Still
no.
No.
That's No, I think you're playing this game correctly by giving strong answers. Yes.
I'm going to give another wriggle. Okay. I'm going to give another wriggle fit here as well, which I think helps with many of these answers. Which is generally, I don't think sort of binary thinking about beliefs is that helpful. I believe this, I do not believe that. I think a sort of more Bayesian credence-based approach is much more useful. Right. One, because it's more sensitive to evidence, and two, because it just intellectually and emotionally makes it easier for us to change our minds. And I think it just is the best way of understanding reality. So in that context, you might want to moderate my answers to say there's a vanishingly small credence there is a God or an afterlife, but in shorthand, that's still a no.
All right. Okay, here's an interesting one. Can a true sentientist be a capitalist?
Oh, that is interesting. So one of the strange things about sentientism is, again, I think has a pretty firm stance on epistemology and ethics, but it doesn't have an explicit statement about what the implications are for political systems. So you will talk to some sentientists who will say, you absolutely cannot be a capitalist because we need, a socialist model or an anarchist model or something else. And you'll talk to others who will say the opposite. So that's one of the fascinating things about building the communities here, is that people can come to a sentiocentric compassion for all sentient beings and still have very different views about modes of political organization or models of economics about how to put that compassion into practice. And they will all cite the confusing and difficult evidence and reasoning that goes on in politics and economics to support their view, but there seems to be a dizzying plethora. So I've talked to people who call themselves sentientists, and I think genuinely are sentientists. They're committed to a naturalistic way of understanding the world, and they have a sentiocentric compassion, who are anarchists, neoliberals, libertarians, classical liberals, social liberals, across the scope, socialists, communists. I think the one thing that probably does drive quite directly is when you're thinking about social conservatism versus liberalism, I think there is a stronger correlation there with social liberalism, because a sentiocentric stance is concerned with the suffering of every sentient being. It's basically an anti-oppression stance. It's basically an anti-discrimination stance. All sentient beings matter. So it takes you to a socially liberal place, I think. But in terms of political economy or mode of political organization, there's a dazzling variety of ways of making the world better.
Well, let's get even deeper down this one. Can a true sentientist be pro-choice?
Yeah. So the abortion issue is really interesting. And I do think sentientism is the appropriate ethical model towards it. And the short answer is yes. So to continue my my clear responses,
yes.
and I haven't done any surveys, because there's no formality or organization or membership. There's nothing to join or leave. There's no governance. There's no rules, if you like. But my sense is that there's quite a strong pro-choice prevalence, I would argue, amongst sentientists. And I think a sentientist view on the abortion issue, one, clearly acknowledges that the family and the mother in particular are sentient beings whose situation and well-being and suffering and flourishing and interests matter deeply and powerfully. So that's sort of obvious and a given. When thinking about moral consideration for the fetus or the unborn child, again, the question is, at what point in the development process does sentience emerge, and to what degree? And a sentientist stance would say, well, we should follow the science to try and assess that. And we're never going to be perfect. You're never going to, there's no light bulb moment where these things happen, but at least you can use a scientific worldview to try and, in an unbiased way, understand at what point in the pregnancy process it makes sense to grant moral consideration or start granting some degree of moral consideration to that unborn child. And actually, when you look at many of the modern laws around the world, that's one of the central things that guides much of the thinking is, when does pain start to be part of the question, or when does the cerebrum, link together in certain ways that might enable the unborn child to have experiences as well. So I think it would be consistent with that. But what it doesn't do is then, so it might give you an indication at what point in the process it makes sense to start according to moral consideration. What it doesn't do is tell you how to resolve trade-offs between different sets of interests too. So I think my stance, for example, would be, follow the science about when sentience starts to emerge, and but then you need to consider that in the context of all of the other people involved and what's going on, and that leads me personally to a pro-choice stance. But again, you get to more extreme situations around the edges, and the question might balance. But
yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think.
Yeah, and it's incredibly consistent.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's again, it doesn't give you a magic easy answer. There are so many really difficult ethical trade-offs, but at least it gives you the raw material, if you like. It's like, at what point do which entities matter as you're trying to work through these sometimes difficult situations?
Yeah. Okay. Here's I don't know if this will be more or less controversial. Can a true sentientist own a pet?
I would say they can't own a pet. I wouldn't suggest that's the right terminology. But I think we could share our home and have companion animals in our family. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think many sentientists would say the idea of owning another sentient being, is problematic. It might be a legal truth just in the way society works at the moment, but in the same way as a humanist would, if you suggested owning another human, they might respond negatively. I think a sentientist would respond in the same way about the owning of other animals, again, because it implies control and exploitation and so on. But I think, cross-species, having non-human animals as family members can be a wonderful thing to do. I think there's a strong, particularly if the non-human animal is, for example, rescued or, comes from a difficult situation, you can, give them a great deal of joy and love and affection and get that benefit for your family too. I would suggest that, breeding non-human animals so that they can then be sold as pets is clearly wrong and something I wouldn't advocate at all.
Oh. Yeah.
Because again, it's using those animals as products. It's a point of exploitation, and they're commodified, right? And their interests aren't really at the forefront of the choices. And there are so many rescue animals out there that need loving homes. Let's look after them.
Mm-hmm. And Jamie, finally, can a true sentientist want to create a sentient AI?
This is a really interesting one. I think we could. But I think you think about it in a similar way as the decision to have a child. I'm spitballing here, but I think there's a parallel, right? So
this is also the first time you've equivocated on one of these.
yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, but I think, and that's partly because the equivocation is really important here, because in the same way as, if you're thinking about whether to have a child, you'd want to have decent confidence that child is going to have a good life, right? And I think you'd apply that same concept to creating a sentient AI. Now, the hesitation in my voice and the equivocation is because I think the default stance of humanity at the moment means we're not really ready to take that decision. Because if you take how we think about non-human animals as the default, that's where human values are at the moment. I think there's a much greater risk we create sentient AI deliberately or by accident and run them on a server that leads to a new form of interminable suffering. So That's my hesitation. I don't think as humans, our value system is ready for us to do that responsibly yet. And there are, serious philosophers and activists working in the AI field who, Thomas Metzinger is one fascinating example, who's actually called for a moratorium on the development of AI that may turn out to be sentient, because he's worried about the potential for us to create, the next horrific wave of needless suffering. And unfortunately, us humans haven't fixed the old ones yet.
Yeah.
So that's the equivocation. No. Yes, but you've got to be really careful, right? Really careful.
No.
Well, that's fantastic. Anything else you want to leave us with for? We'll give you the last word. You can button it up. What do people need to know about sentientism, or what should they think about it going forward?
Yeah, I think many people already agree with it, right? What better way of understanding reality is there but to use evidence and reason? What else would you do? And what reason is there to exclude any suffering from our moral consideration? Surely we already care about all suffering beings. So my appeal really is, particularly for an atheist or a humanist audience, is we've already done this amazing job of breaking out of these powerful social norms, following evidence and reason to find a more compassionate way forward. And this is just the next frontier, right? We've got this next step to do. We've got to apply that same level of intellectual courage and ethical commitment to thinking seriously about the non-humans that suffer too. It's never been easier. It's never been more urgent. And I think it will be good for us human sentient beings as well. So that would be my final appeal. But the other thing I'd say is that, it's just a worldview. It's very open. It's very pluralistic. I'd love to continue the conversation. So if people want to reach out via sentientism.info, follow Sentientism on Twitter or the various social media, join our groups. They're open to anyone interested, not just signed up Sentientists. I'd love people to connect. And then it's the sort of, like other broad worldviews, you can apply it in every area of your life. Yes, you can think about personal choices you take, and I think going vegan would be a great step, but you can run it through all of the institutional and societal change as well. You can work all the way up to, should the UN switch from having a universal declaration of human rights to a universal declaration of sentient rights? So it really is that sort of breadth of worldview that you can run through all of your thinking about how to make a better world. And hopefully it's an interesting idea and maybe a compelling one to some.
No, definitely. Yeah. Thanks so much, Jamie. This was great.
Such a pleasure. It was an honor to talk to your audience.
Okay, that was Jamie Woodhouse, Sentientism. Todd, what did you make of it?
Oh, I mean, look, Jamie knows exactly what he's talking about. You can tell he's done this before, and he puts it together. It's tough to disagree with. Did you find a weak spot that you could make a hole in and say like, this isn't for me?
No, not really.
Right. It's pretty good.
It's one of those things where I think this is like ethics and morality kind of in general, where it's like, yeah, I completely agree with everything, but then you sort of don't. Why don't you put it into practice immediately?
Yep, I know what you mean. And then, so you're saying you're not going to put it into practice immediately?
No, I think I'm trying to be vegan these days, and I mostly succeed. Like it's just some things are like, like milk chocolate or something is difficult to find a way around that.
That's the tough one. That you find that one? Man. All right.
Yeah. That's a difficult one. And like a lot of stuff has like milk ingredients in it. So like many, I was going to reveal myself as like a junk food person, but like,
Man,
different kinds of.
That's fine. That's an ethos.
Yeah. Like different kind of like potato chips or whatever have like, even if they're not, like, like sour cream and onion or something, obviously that would, but other ones you wouldn't think of have milk ingredients or something.
Right. It's like creamy stuff that gets you. Yeah.
But for the most part, I think I've switched. So it's I think it becomes a problem, like in social situations or something, if someone's serving meat or whatever. that's a difficult thing. But
Yeah, but
I think
the thing is, it's like we get to work through this, right? Like we all do that, right? And one of the things that I mean, the fact that we are bad vegans, right? Everybody's a bad vegan. Unless, your parents were butchers and you've never eaten a vegetable in your life, right? Like why and to go through it really quickly, like most meat eaters only eat maybe like three animals, right? Three types of animals, four. And they don't eat all the parts. They don't eat the faces, they don't eat the eyes, they don't eat the brains, they don't eat the feet, they don't eat the tail, right? Like it's the pickiest stuff. Why is it that they have such a limited palate? I mean, they're basically vegans. They're not eating dolphins or whales or elephants or giraffes, right? There's most animals are not eating. Why is it just these? And I think part of it is like we can see it in a lot of what Jamie was talking about today, that we kind of already have this concept baked in, right? We have moral boundaries. People have a moral boundary when they eat meat. That boundary is like you can eat cows and pigs and maybe sheep, but you can't eat dogs and cats, right? That's a moral boundary.
Yeah.
They value them.
Yeah.
And like people think about that all the time when they're, you're moving a house. If you move to a place, can you bring your cat or dog, right? Where's the cat going to stay? You think about these things. So it's already incorporated in there. And we've talked to other people on the show about this, and they kind of like we do see this unification of these ideas, right? I think we talked to Monica Miller about animal rights. I think Aaron Rabinovitz talked about this, where the idea being like there's a moral truth out there, and we can get pretty close to it. And this is part of it, right? Like we have what Jamie did today. What he brought to us is he talked about a sort of moral methodology where because we're atheists and we can look at humanism, we look at a material world, right? We see reality is material. It's not spiritual. It's knowable to a certain extent. Based on what we know, we can shape our actions and behaviors. And that gives us a rough guideline for how we ought to behave. It doesn't tell us exactly everything we can do, but it points us in this direction, and we get to decide what we do with it. For an atheist, like this is essential. Right now, if you look at the moral decisions being made in the US, at the forefront is a religious minority trying to dictate to free people, trying to tell them, you have to do this because we believe in a tyrannical sky god. We believe, some guy lectures me every week about what's in this book, and therefore this is how we have to behave. Having a framework that allows us to explore our morality, to define it, to show how we come to these conclusions in a way that's mutually that we can discuss, gives us a grounding. It gives us ground to stand on, and it gives us ground to stand on as a growing minority that's coming into a plurality, which will at some point begin to put this in motion, right? And like he was talking about, his goals aren't just to, arise the consciousness of people who eat meat. It's about, well, how do we put this into law? How does the the Universal Declaration of Rights look if we change it to sentient life, right? And again, we've talked to people taking this into courtrooms. What happens when we bring this into court? What happens if this is the framework by which we make laws? And it's there, it's acceptable, it's in the open, it's understandable, and you can use it. It's clear. So in that sense, I think it's really, really important. And it's not necessarily the conclusion that we come to that's important. It's that we have this roadmap to get there. Because you can take it as far as humanism and stop. You can take it all the way to deep ecology or Mama Gaia, right? And say like, no, it is the earth that's alive. It's our form of collective consciousness. That's the only thing that matters. We need to preserve that at all costs. Well, if that's your moral, if that's what this has pointed you towards, okay, maybe there is some validity. We need to have a discussion because that's a little crazy. But we're not talking about valuing a bunch of rats carrying fleas with the bubonic plague over human life here. We're talking about having a moral discussion about what's important to us.
Yeah, I think it was when we talked about abortion in the closing part. Obviously he said, like, sentientism doesn't give itself an answer, but it gives you a way to think about it. And I mean, like, I think that's yeah. I mean, obviously, like, thinking about it, like, okay, when, if ever, is the fetus sentient? And then even if it is, I mean, then how does it balance in these other cases? Because obviously other sentient beings are involved too. And I think, like, obviously people who are pro life they're not thinking like that. They're not following that framework of thinking about the issue. So yeah, I think I think it's a really valuable way to think about the world. And again, I don't think it's hard to think of like a really objection unless you just say like, to hell with the animals. Like, I don't care about them. Like, it's really it's really just like that.
Yeah, but you got to say why, and you can say it in this framework. You can, right?
Yeah.
There are ways
No, but
you
I
can do
mean,
it.
no, I mean, yeah, but I mean, the people disagreeing, it's just like, I mean, I think it's, the analogies are not perfect. When you talk about, centuries ago when people were willing to kill or enslave people who were different from themselves. I think it's like, how do you find a way to put something outside the circle or whatever of like moral consideration, I guess. And obviously that's expanded now that everyone, for the most part, I think, values all humans. Like, it wouldn't say, this person is outside moral consideration or something. But and I think that, like, I think we're seeing it with animals too, because obviously there's animal cruelty laws and things like that. So yeah, I think it's a valuable perspective.
Yeah,
Yep.
great guest, had a lot to say, a lot to think about, and we can come to our own conclusions, figure out where we want to draw the line.
Yeah,
it's fantastic stuff.
I also found the part about, we talked about AI sentience in the bonus segment, and that was also fascinating. So much more to go into. Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, as soon as that comes up in the news again, we got to get it back just to talk about that, because it is a lot, and it's a lot more. It's pretty amazing, and and that is totally, it's speculative, right? At this point, it's amazing. Anyway, so that's something definitely to be on the lookout for. I'm sure he writes about it a lot on his webpage. He's got lots of writings published as well. You can check out the links below. There'll be a lot there. Otherwise, everybody, we got to give some thanks, right?
Yeah.
Big thanks for Japan. Crushing it. Great track.
Great. Yeah. Nailed it. We got to thank our Patreon supporters, Lars, Debbie, and the AHS Plus blog. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And to all the listeners out there for listening, we really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Hope give it a big think. Reach out to us if you have any thoughts about this as well. Things you would and would not include in Sentientism. And if you can't contribute to our Patreon, please like and subscribe below. And that's it. Until next time. Bye-bye.